you all for coming. The first round of applause is for John and Brian, without whom we wouldn't be here. They were, who's in the class? Okay, so a couple of you, and then some of you are not. So for those of you who don't know, this is part of, my name is Jeff Ball, and my wife and I are what Stanford calls resident fellows. So we live 10 feet over there with our 2 daughters and our dog. The context within which we're here is that we've begun over the past couple of years in this dorm called Robley Hall an effort to focus on sustainability, and we can talk more about that at the end. But broadly, what we're trying to do is to inculcate a sense of what it means to try to live more sustainably among students who live here. The notion behind this was that there are a lot of wonderful classes at Stanford that talk about various things related to sustainability, incredible research going on this campus, and there didn't seem to be a place to try to put those lessons into practice on a daily basis. So that's what we've been embarking on here. We have a competition going on. I just get to stand up and tell you about it. I'm not really doing any of the work for it. But there's a competition going on where each of the 11 halls, Robley has 300 students, each of the 11 halls in Robley is competing against one another to see who can score the most points about sustainable living. We've got like 2/3 of the dorm involved in this. Verinda is doing a lot of this great work. So it's very exciting, and that's the context within which this Harder series occurs. And John and Brian do yeoman's work conceptualizing every quarter a theme for these Hard Earth talks, and then figuring out how to sit down and talk with the speakers, the student speakers. Every quarter there are 4 student speakers, graduate students, PhD students typically, but also we've had law students and business students and what else? PhD law, business master students who come and give talks on the theory that it occurred to us that there wasn't really a forum for graduate students around Stanford whose research focuses on sustainability to come and talk. They get talked to a lot, but they're doing really interesting work, and it's great to hear them talk. Anyway, at the end of every quarter, the 5th speaker is a kind of a luminary doing something really, really interesting. And we're incredibly lucky to have Sila here today, who is CEO of EIQ Mobility. And I won't go through a long introduction and bio of Sila, because some of that's on the poster that you saw, but suffice it to say that Sila has a really interesting background at Slack, the accelerator, which is just along Sand Hill Road near the Stanford campus, and then at Google, and then coming back to Stanford working on something called the Bits and Watts program, all of which has to do, and Sila will correct me if I get the details wrong, but all of which has to do with trying to modernize the electrical grid. Much of which has to do with that. Taking a grid that was optimized for a fossil fuel infrastructure and trying to change that grid, essentially the highway network of the electricity system, to a system that runs increasingly on renewable energy and also that adapts to a much more efficient use of energy regardless of how the energy is produced. And Sila, I had the pleasure of talking to Sila on a panel earlier this year, and Sila, to my mind, has a fascinating story both about how Sila got to decide that this area of electrifying fleets was what she wanted to spend her time on, and also because a lot of these talks end up, and I'll be quiet in a second, but because a lot of these talks end up being not just about the science and about sustainability as kind of an endeavor, but really a life story of someone who's lived a longer life than many of you sitting in this room. Sila has a really, really interesting kind of backstory to how she decided that she wanted to move away from working full-time for the university toward taking the risk of doing a startup. And I think it's a story that's really, really interesting and important for you, those of you sitting here, to hear. Those of you who are trying to figure out what you're going to do with your lives and to what extent you might take a plunge and sort of bet a lot on your idea. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, now that the expectations are set really high, let me just bring it down. Thank you so much, Jeff and John and Brian, I think, for having me here. I really appreciate being here. Jeff told me to talk about a couple of things, so I'll talk about life stuff, professional stuff, climate stuff, and some advice. So you can stop and ask any questions anytime you want. I don't have any slides, so this is a new kind of way of speaking for me. But let me sort of start with life stuff. I was a graduate student at Carnegie Mellon University and then stayed there as a research assistant. While I was there, I realized that, and I was a part of this intelligent building group over there, and I realized that there was all these people who would come there from Department of Energy, from big companies like Steelcase, Honeywell, Johnson Controls. And they would talk about these things that we were doing as a research. And they would talk about their impact, they would talk about their adoption. And then I realized that I didn't understand half of the things they were saying. I knew what I was developing, I knew that I was doing really cool machine learning stuff way in the 90s. And yes, Jeff called me old, I realized that too. But you know, people didn't understand. First, I didn't know how to communicate it to people. People didn't understand. It was far out for their applications. And I realized like I wasn't talking their own language. So some of the language I thought I could learn in business school. So I started a business master. And yes, it was really helpful in terms of speaking their language, but there were still some things missing. And so one thing that I learned in the business school, I had this really great professor who passed away recently. He said, if you are a company, if you want to win, and you want to win big, you have to win in the courts. And that just didn't sound right to me. Like, what does that mean, you know? Over time, like, think about this, I'll leave you with that, but I'll come back to it later. Then after Carnegie Mellon, I had kids, so I took some time off, about 3 years. I thought I was going to go crazy at home with two boys. 3 years was a long time for me. I really enjoyed spending time with the kids, but in the technology field, it's a really long time to stay at home and sort of, you know, think about what you may have to get back to. And, you know, all the skills that you have worked on may be a little stale by the time you get to the workforce again. So it's a very difficult time for me, but what I decided to do is whatever I do, if I'm going to leave my kids, that has to count for something, right? So I have to do something impactful, otherwise it's not worth leaving 2 kids and going out to work. So I started working at Berkeley Lab. Berkeley Lab is known for their buildings program and their impact in terms of leading research. So I was really excited to get a job there. I was ready to like just sweep the floors if they needed me, because I really wanted to be in that environment, to think about, to talk and think with scientists, and to really understand what how they're thinking about impacting the world. I was there as a part-time, unpaid person at first, and then got hired in about 3 months, and then stayed about 12 years. So a lot of the things I learned at Berkeley Lab from really amazing mentors. I had an amazing mentor, Marianne Piet, who was extremely demanding and extremely helpful at the same time, which really changed my life while I was there. Then about 6 years into my Berkeley Lab, they were building this grid integration team. No one wanted to take it on. A, because it was difficult, people, and B, it was a difficult topic, right? So I said, I'll take it, because I never say no to anything, right? If there's an offer, I always say yes. And then I like bang my head afterwards. But, you know, my first reaction has always been to say yes. So I took that on for several years before I decided to leave the lab. And the reason I decided to leave the lab was, one day I woke up and realized that I have 15 projects that I'm running, 30 people. I spend most of my time either planning budgets, financials, or dealing with people. And yes, I know that I was making a difference in people's lives, but I really didn't think that what I was doing day to day was, really valuable to me. So I decided to leave the lab and asked a few places if I could go work for them. One of them was Google, the other one was Slack. They both said yes, so I said, okay, let me just, do this together and test you guys out together. So I did that for a year, both Slack and Google part-time, until I chose Slack. And there's a whole story there, I'll tell you later, but I'm not going to get into that. While at Google, I wanted to, Google's all about information to the people, right? That's their motto. And I realized that they weren't doing any energy information to people. And that was a big problem because I wanted Google to take the position of providing all sorts of energy information to everyone. People didn't know about their rates. People didn't know about when to use electricity. People didn't know about when the congestions, where the congestions in the grid were. There are lots of unknowns in our daily lives that on the energy side, and I wanted Google to own that. They didn't, so I love. So then when I came to Slack, we started building Grid Integration Systems and Mobility Group, and that's where I really dove into data analytics for grid integration of systems. There also that I started getting into electrification of vehicles again, because I did a first pilot in California, vehicle-to-grid pilot in California in 2009. Started in 2009, ended in 2015. So anyway, so lots of things, everything yes, lots of projects. And then one day I was at a meeting for Bits and Watts, and I said, we're doing all these great things at Stanford and Slack. Schneider, a company like yours, how long can we transition some of these things into your existing products, into your systems? And they said, this is all great, but it's 7 years down our product roadmap. So can you hold on for 7 years? I'm like, we don't have 7 years. So that was a big eye-opener for me. So I walk out from that meeting thinking, I can't wait 7 years. We don't have 7 years to wait for some of these things to get out. So at the time also, Schneider saw that I was really frustrated, and they said, why don't you, we're putting together an incubation team. We have a consultancy team that we hired to help this incubation. It's a very weird thing, but we're taking design thinking and incorporating into an incubation of a product, an idea. And I said, what's the idea? And they said, fleet electrification. And I love that, you know. I looked a little bit deeper into it. Fleets produce about 14% of greenhouse gas emissions in the US. If we're going to do an opportunity, instead of doing one-off electric vehicles for consumers, you touch one fleet and 5 to 10% of that fleet is retired every year, so you have a 5 to 10% impact every year if you can touch as many fleets as you could. So I love the idea. I said, so what's the design thinking application in this incubation? They said, well, you sit in a room for at least 10 to 12 hours and talk to 10 to 12 people every day. You take very strict notes, and then in 2 months you go back to your notes and figure out what to do. I'm like, really? I can't talk to people 10 to 12 hours. I'm an introvert. That's never going to happen. And so that was the starting of figuring out how to talk to people 10 to 12 hours a day, taking notes, and then making sense of those notes. So every week we will talk to, 50 or so people. And then at the end of the week we would synthesize our learning, and we would just sort of think about what the pain points are. And the questions were really simple. The 2 key questions we asked were, what are the biggest pain points that frustrate you personally when you try to electrify your fleet? And then the second question was, if you had a magic wand, what would you do with it? And so the magic wand question, of course, is all over the place. But one of the common themes that we heard is that if the fleet manager or the operator had a magic wand, they would magically have electric vehicles and the EVSEs, the charging infrastructure, appear. And they would work really nicely with each other. They would have visibility, and it wouldn't cost any penny more than their current existing fleet. And so that was a nice thing. I'm like, that's nice, so we can't do that. But we'll try, right? So we said at the end of our incubation that we're going to deliver electric fleet as a service. What it means is that in the future, we want to deliver everything but the drivers. Drivers may go away in the future anyway, so our business stays the same. It's a very big goal, and if you have studied business, it is very capital intensive, right? We are not going to achieve it right away. So our starting point, and we did this through really prototype testing. We came up with some prototypes. We tested them with at least 60 customers, potential customers, through these interviews. Now the interviews are not half an hour anymore, they're more like an hour, where they click through things and then give us feedback about the functionality as well as their experience. So that was really helpful, because now we had the makings of a product that meet their needs, and we already gotten feedback on those. So the product that resonated most with them was complete electrification strategy tool. What does that mean? Fleets want to input their simple information. The fleet operators use their own spreadsheets, and they want to collect all the information from different systems, put it in their spreadsheets, and then they make all these complicated plans. They want to just dump the spreadsheet to someone else's machine and have someone make sense of that. They collect fuel information, route information, departure, arrival information. Some are very detailed, some not so much. So the idea is that we get all that data and we tell them which locations, because these are national fleets, which locations, which routes within those locations, which vehicle and charging combination, optimal combination they should acquire, what are the costs and benefits of their options, and also environmental impacts. So I was really surprised as a whole why they cared about environmental impacts. All of these big companies have really some sort of metrics around sustainability, and a lot of their sustainability folks that we talked to, they didn't have a lot of money, or sometimes no money whatsoever, but they had huge goals. And electrification of fleets really helps them achieve those goals, especially if we can do it at or below current costs. So they were really engaged, they were really helpful in getting us talking to the right people within their organizations, getting the right feedback, and then working on our products. So we call this tool EIQ Evaluate. It is supposed to take the data and evaluate optimal deployment of electric fleets for that company. Now, we know that a lot of things are changing in this space, so a consultancy company can come in and do it for them. But the moment they finish it and leave, if there are new vehicles, new incentives, new rates, the whole strategy is useless in a sense. So we decided that we're going to develop a software tool and do it perpetually whenever there's a change in some of these rates, some of these vehicles, some of these routes, whatever it may be. It would trigger another run and show them the new strategy. Not an easy software tool to build. Today, we're about a month into our development. A lot of the things we have, we're doing by hand, what we call a Wizard of Oz approach. They dump the data into a website that looks really cool. And then we take it, separate the data, look at it, run it through our Python notebooks, and then generate the data, make it look fancy, and send it back to them in a couple of weeks. In the process, we have weekly meetings with them, so they know that there's some progress happening. The whole idea is to automate some of those pieces so that they can get it fairly quickly, not in 2 weeks, but maybe a couple of hours, maybe a couple of clicks, who knows, in the future. So then the second product that we're working on is called hardware or infrastructure as a service. So just like the early days of solar, where it was very expensive and it was an unproven technology, it was really expensive to put solar on your roof. And people didn't really like that because it was way too expensive and required permits and all sorts of things. Infrastructure on the EV fleet side is very similar to that today. It's expensive, it requires permitting, it requires construction, it requires trenching, it gets really expensive, and not for the equipment itself, but the whole deployment becomes really expensive. So we said, can we get into a mile purchase agreement with fleets? What it means is that we'll put in this infrastructure, and instead of selling you energy, we'll sell you miles. And let's say today your fuel cost is 20 cents per mile. We'll sell it to you at the same price. But you're going to get into a 10-year contract with us, and maybe the first 3 million miles is going to be at 20 cents, and then the rest is going to be 15 cents. That makes it really predictable for fleets, so they don't have to deal with fluctuating gasoline prices. For a 10-year predictability, it's a huge thing for them. And then on top of it, it guarantees that we're going to have some sort of payment mechanism that covers the cost of the infrastructure, plus some profits for us. Now on that product, we're really looking at how to partner with people today who have products that we can use it as a model purchase agreement, just to sort of figure out all the software requirements that we need to build on top of other people's equipment. But the idea is over time, as we're trying to cut down on margins or grow our margins, we will develop our own product, and we have a design for all that. So that's sort of where we are in terms of where the company is. Let me tell you a little bit of things I learned through doing all this. Communication research, as a scientist, very different from communication in the VC world. No one cares about the environmental impact, except if they're really impact-driven funds, right? So I started with climate change and all that. They're like, can you just get to the, P&Ls and the revenues and market size and all that? And we're like, okay, yeah, we can get there, So a lot of eye-openers for me in terms of how to present a business versus a research idea. There were also a lot of eye-openers to me in terms of how to deal with negotiating a term sheet, right? You see other sides of people where you didn't expect. Everyone tends to be thinking about the best case scenario and the worst case scenario at the same time, which is really interesting. And so I learned a lot. But the nice thing about this whole process was that we are in Silicon Valley are very lucky. There are lots of people with a lot of experience who can guide us through this. There are a lot of good law firms, lawyers who can help you if you pay them. There are a lot of good advisors who have gone through this process and know one piece or the other. But what I personally found out was that everyone has their own story, and you need to create your own story, your own set of principles, and your own set of ideas. Everyone wants to share their experience, but at the end of the day, you need to figure out what our experience has to be and what works for our team versus the investors. So every term sheet is a snowflake in a sense. Let's see. How are we doing on time?
We're good. You're
Okay.
fine. You can keep going
Just
a little
cut
bit.
me off.
Yeah.
Okay. So a little bit of the climate stuff.
Sorry, just really
Okay.
quick. Where the sustainability impact, where is it coming from? You said that is important to them.
Yes.
From where? From within? From external? Where?
So some of the fleet management companies or the fleets themselves, they have sustainability goals for their like FedEx, right? They have sustainability goals for their facilities. They have sustainability goals for their vehicles. Different parts of the organizations have different goals. For the fleet part, it's really about cutting down the diesel. Most of the trucks are diesel emissions. So there has been a move in terms of natural gas in fleets, as well as electrification. So in terms of their sustainability goals, it's really coming from reducing greenhouse gas emissions.
Is it their goal? Or is
It's
it
their goals. It's the
not coming from
company's.
the courts?
No,
Or
no,
from
it's
them?
not.
Okay.
It's coming from the CEO or their chief officers, C-level people who want to continue building a good reputation and brand for their companies. So a lot of these folks come from that side of and then it's a top-down and bottom-up too. Okay, so let's see. I collected some numbers. I said about 14% of the fleets is causing the greenhouse gas. 14% of greenhouse gas emissions are due to fleets. That's about 725 million tons in the U.S., tons of CO2 in the U.S. And let's say 5 to 10% of the vehicles retire every year. That's about 36 to 72 million tons of CO2 reduction opportunity, just looking at fleets today. Now, looking at our little company, I did some back of the envelope calculations. And if we reach our 5-year revenue targets that target about 1,500 or so fleets, our contribution is going to be about 260,000 tons of CO2 reduction, which it's a drop in the bucket when you think about the entire space, but we're just one company. There will be others in this space, and there are already others in this space. So I think that there is a huge opportunity that we're only sort of picking at one part of it, but there's a huge opportunity altogether. And people understand this, right? There's a lot of electric vehicle manufacturing happening. I don't think I told you, but part of that 14 weeks during the incubation, we took time off and went to China. And we interviewed 23 different companies in China. And the reason we went to China is not because our little company is going to produce anything for China, Chinese market, but just to understand if the government has seriously pushed, and they did in China, what would be the future of US may look like. And of course it's a top-down, country. There are lots of incentives for government vehicle OEMs and others. But we were able to see a little bit of the future. Now, in China, there are close to 400 types of vehicles in the commercial vehicle space. In the US, it's more like, 30, 40. So very different. There are about 250,000 charging stations in China, and they're all connected to State Grid China's NOC. So at any given time, every 10 seconds, they monitor the entire country's charging loads, and they know exactly where the utilization is happening. And they're really scratching their heads because 250,000 charging stations are not fully utilized. And some of their incentives will be going away by the end of the year. So now they're sort of thinking about how to get the utilization increase and also how to continue to have, incentivize these vehicles. So one of the big drivers in China, which is very different than US, is air quality. People don't necessarily care about climate change, and people in red states and blue states, vary in terms of how much they care about climate change. But everyone cares about air quality. Everyone cares about air quality when you go outside and your kids are playing outside and it's really bad weather, very bad air quality, they're coughing all the time. It has immediate impact on you, your family, and now you think about doing something. So the entire big cities, Shanghai, Beijing, Shenzhen, the three that we went to at least, were very open to doing something about this. And they have these license plate rules where cars go, if you're odd or even, you go different days of the week. But electric vehicles, electric cars go all the time. They can go anywhere, anytime. So that's a big thing for companies like Alibaba or SF or Jingdong, where they are huge delivery company. They have huge online sales companies with delivery trucks that need to go into these cities constantly. So electrification is extremely important for them. And so in the US too, it doesn't matter if it's blue state, red state, if you have an air quality issue, then electrification of fleets becomes a really important piece of the work that needs to be done in those states. So, that's sort of one of the big drivers that is not climate related, but definitely a big driver that I see. Yeah.
Do you have an idea of why utilization in China is not as good as expected?
So one of the things they did was they did these charging station installations between the north and south and east and west corridors. But there's a lot of trucks right now, and it's every 50 kilometers, right? But there are a lot of electric trucks in the highways. There are a lot of vans. There are a lot of passenger cargo vans, shuttles, and things like that for the cities. But for the long haul, there are a lot of truck companies that do that. They're not electric. So that's one of the major things, and they recognize that, and so they're trying to incentivize some of the government companies to deliver, class 6 to class 8 type of trucks. The other reason is that the cities are tight. When you think about electrifying transit in Shenzhen or in Beijing or parts of the country in the big cities, it's very tough to get in all these electrical equipment, finding the power availability pockets. So that the integration of these systems is also a problem. And once they're integrated, even utilization increases, but getting them into where the utilization will be the highest is very difficult, typically. So that was a China experience, which was really interesting. I thought I'd share with you. Okay, so advice. That's the end of my talk. So, when I think about my experience, I think, as I told you, I say yes to everything because I think I always regret things that I didn't do, not the things that I did. So that's important for me personally. I don't know if it's the case for you. And so I don't also care about, in the research world, I didn't care if we failed or not, right? Every opportunity is a learning opportunity. Now my thinking is shifting a little bit on the corporate side because someone said failure is not an option. So I wake up every day thinking failure is not an option, and that's a little bit stressful than, like failing, but failing well for the good of the people. So that's a big switch for me in my mind, and I have to remind myself every morning that failure is not an option. The other thing is that during the research time or the incubation time, I really realized that finding the right solutions and having them perform in the context in their own context is very important. So you can come up with a great solution for a problem that you think exists, but if the customers who are going to buy your stuff, they don't believe that it's a big problem on their end, it's manageable, you're never going to sell your product, right? The other thing is that you can come up with this amazing solution, like I did when I was at Berkeley Lab. I came up with this great pre-cooling solution for buildings. So we were running a simulation on buildings, and we thought if we do pre-cooling before a demand response event, we could save significantly more. My algorithms just said that you need to increase 0.5 degrees Fahrenheit and then 0.2 and 0.3, whatever. Only when I went to the buildings, I realized, the adjustment's only done by a degree. You can't do the decimals. So I thought I had the best solution in the world, yet I couldn't implement it in the real world. So being able to sort of think through the problem in the context of the real world, low cost, easy adoption kind of scenarios is extremely important. As a person and as now a company runner, I guess, I always look at people and myself. I started with myself, of course, but I think when I'm doing something, I always try to also think about what other value I can deliver. I don't want to work too hard, right? I don't want to work too hard. I don't want anyone to work too hard, but I want people who work to think about working smart. So, and I always sort of think about that, right? I want to deliver extra value to any project, any work that I do, but I want to think about it differently, or I want to develop a process that's going to make it easier for other people. And that always sort of paid out for me, in a sense. And sort of thinking through the problems differently and making it easy for everyone as you're doing things and trying to work towards an automation always seems to be it worked out for me all these years. And then I guess my last point is that we hired a painter when we moved to our new house, and we asked him to paint the kitchen. And he said, "I'm done." And we're like, "Great, wonderful." Then our refrigerator broke, and we had to pull the refrigerator. We saw that behind the refrigerator he didn't paint. So I guess my advice is, please, if you're going to do a job, paint behind the refrigerator. It goes a long way. The way that I can sort of, this philosophy helped me a lot in terms of talking with the VCs. There were some questions the first few VC discussions were funny because I didn't know what they were asking even. But as we progressed talking to more VCs and getting their feedback, it was really helpful for me to think above and beyond what to expect and then cover all those issues before I get in front of the next round of discussions. And so I was really prepared for the discussion, and that was a big learning experience. So I'll stop. talked a lot, and see if you have any questions. Yes.
I was curious about in your simulations for your long-range trucking company, what pieces of technology don't exist at the moment,
Yeah.
which you think would be like the most impactful to actually move that industry forward? Because it seems like it's still a fairly long ways off. And
Yeah.
I can imagine there's a lot of hardware innovations that are needed to actually progress that to a manageable goal.
I think it's not the technology necessarily that's a problem, but putting together the existing technologies in a way to serve that sector is extremely important. So let me explain what I'm trying to say. We can build any software tool that takes the data and provides a strategy for a fleet, right? It's not a rocket science. No one's doing it because it's extremely complex and there are too many moving parts. So that needs to be done. It's just hunkering it down and getting it done. That's the reality. Now, when we move towards infrastructure as a service or fleet management with electric fleets, there are key things that, as a business, I care about, right? And they're not as exciting for research, but if I'm going to own these really high-valued assets, then I want to make sure that I monitor these high-valued assets and I actually predict their performance and I protect their performance so that I can make more money, right? And deliver value to the fleets and deliver value to my company. So that's a different kind of a look. So what do I mean? My charging infrastructure may have switchgear embedded into it. Switchgears are expensive. Not only are they expensive, they have a lot of wait time if you want to buy a new one, if one is broken, right? So I want to make sure that I monitor that asset as well as I monitor the energy managed for that fleet. I'm maybe willing to pay a little bit more on the energy side to make sure that my asset on the switchgear side is protected. So having that kind of trade-offs haven't been thought about because everyone is thinking about different parts of the chain for their own management. But I think if you think about it holistically and start delivering services holistically, the thinking changes and you see a lot of gaps in these services. The other thing that I care deeply about is the battery management. Today, we have a lot of technologies that help us manage the health of people. We keep health records, not a big deal. We should be doing the same thing with batteries, especially in a fleet situation where batteries may be swapped. We want to make sure to understand where that battery's been, how many times it's been cycled, how many, how it was used and stored, so that we can actually capture the residual value of the vehicles more appropriately and also start thinking about second life of those batteries. And so those kind of services do not exist today, and that's something that we want to build. Yeah.
I'm interested to know how you got to the idea of moving from the software to owning the full life cycle, if you will. Especially from a business model perspective, in the sense that they're two very different business models, one being much more capital intensive than the other.
So I think sort of the first tool that we're developing is a gateway drug for us to sell other things, right? That's how I'm thinking. I think that we're not going to do everything ourselves. So my goal is to build all of these sets of services and probably sell them. But I need to be able to use and prove that those services work before I can start selling them to other people, right? Or using them appropriately to my company's benefit. So those are the two paths. I'll deliver those services and test them and build them. And in the meantime, I'll think about the other parts that I need to build or optimize. If there's a huge opportunity or huge margin for hardware, developing the hardware myself, it's just a systems integration project with some management algorithms on top of it. None of this is really rocket science. It is a lot of work. It requires deep thinking and knowledge, but it's not necessarily rocket science. So I am letting some of this to grow to where they're going to grow into. And I can't predict the future. I have sort of a roadmap that I want to move towards, but things are going to shift along the way, and as long as they're not far off or are really core to our company, I'm happy to sort of steer it in certain angles when the time comes.
So you talked about how you identified a huge problem with fleet electrification and how it's a huge opportunity in the future.
Can you speak?
Okay. Yeah, so you talked about how you identified that fleet electrification would be a huge opportunity in the future, but I guess there's a lot of different ways you could have gone about to address it, like through government, policy, academia. So why did you ultimately decide that like starting your own startup was the best way to address the issue?
So I thought it was the fastest to impact. Government policy cycles are slowish from what I've seen on the energy side, right? The markets are extremely difficult to change and work with on the energy side again, because I'm familiar with those. But the technology and sort of convincingness of a technology is much faster and easier for me. Now, there are a lot of existing policies that support electrification of vehicles and fleets in general in California, and they're growing in Massachusetts and other, places. So there's already some momentum in that area that I want to ride as well with my company, right? But I didn't think about the policy or the market side because I'm an engineer, basically.
Can you explain this contract, this 20-year, 27? I didn't understand what that really entailed. Like, what are you giving them? What is this? What's that contract?
So I'm giving them, let's see. Let me just say that I have this product. We had a design for it, but we don't have the product. I'm giving them 20 DC fast chargers with the switchgear, with the cooling system, and this storage in a container. I take the container, put it in their parking lots. I tie it to the medium voltage power lines, bypassing the low voltage transformer. And then I have these DC hooks for any vehicle to come and plug into that system.
Pop-up charging station.
You can't really pop these up because it's a megawatt
Right.
system.
Yeah. But I mean,
And
it's not a full infrastructure. That you
it's
have to
not
build.
a trenched infrastructure. I can also partner with someone who puts 40 trenched level 2 chargers, and then I will run those chargers over a 5 to 10 year period and charge people by mile.
And the reason they'll sign a 20-year contract is because they want that reliability and predictability.
Exactly. And they want to know that there's someone there who's going to maintain it, who's going to fix it. Because the first generation of chargers, they were very bad, and they were sold to a lot of companies without the maintenance contracts. So they were a big headache in the long run. After a couple of years, things didn't work, and they didn't know who to call because the company they bought it from didn't service them. Yes.
So in this model, the chargers are for one company, right? So how does, I guess, what I don't understand is what fraction, like how many fleets are big enough to be able to have their own charging infrastructure and not be sort of like pulled in with shared infrastructure with everyone else?
So the way that we're working with them is each location, they have an option for private charging if they have the space. They can use the public charging stations en route, and they can do at-home charging. Depending on the size of the battery, the vehicles they select. So the optimization is basically saying you have these 3 options, and within those 3 options you have level 2 at the home and level 2 on the public side, but at the depot you have a combination of level 2 and level 3. And here are the options for your vehicles. We'll tell you exactly what the options in terms of, there's a trade-off between large vehicle batteries versus, you can have a large vehicle battery with a fast DC charger and charge them, very quickly. Or you can have a small battery with level 2 charger, and then you can just charge them as quickly, but then run them more times. So there's a lot of sort of trade-offs that we built into our system to come up with this complete solution. And yes, it does include private public charging. Now, one thing we're not doing is, I think that's what you were asking, is the co-optimization of fleets. Because if one fleet, they're located together, then we can optimize the use of the facility with two fleets. But let's say they're not, then we can't do it, right? And what if one of them decides not to be our customer anymore? Then that's a problem too. We have unused resources. So that's why the scalability of the infrastructure we put, modularity, those are very important key elements. And when we're looking at partners, we're looking at those.
Maybe could you just, so just earlier we were talking about nationwide fleets. So I guess, so like how big are these fleets? Like how many trucks are in?
So let me just tell you, in the fleet space, you have FedEx and UPS, very big fleets.
Yeah.
And then when you come to the top 500 fleets, the size after that is a long tail of 200 fleets, 200 vehicles or less.
But so someone who has 200 trucks probably can't have the charging infrastructure nationwide, can they?
So let me just tell you, yes, they can't. But a lot of those 200 truck ones are local delivery, installation, type of, vans, things like that. So there are solutions for those as well that may not look like this, but could be.
So this isn't necessarily long haul.
Yeah.
I guess in my head I was thinking.
You,
so like
you
New
don't
York,
think
San
about
Francisco.
class 2 to class 8. Anything from, vans to, long haul, big 8-wheelers. But we're really focusing where the vehicles are today, which is the vans, cargo vans, passenger vans, and things like that. Okay.
A quick comment and then a question. You all may understand this, but it occurred to me that some people may not. And I think Sila mentioned this to me previously, that there's an interesting comparison with the solar industry, which Sila mentioned. So think about when solar first started, and if you wanted solar on a house, you actually had to go out and buy the solar panels. And now, if you don't want to buy the solar panels, which cost many thousands of dollars typically, you can go pay a company and you pay them a monthly fee, and they take care of it all for you, and they guarantee you that you will get electricity at a certain price. And you can spec that out and decide that you're going to pay less for electricity now or in the future than you otherwise might have. And that's effectively what Sila's company is trying to do for a fleet that operates trucks. I just thought that
exactly.
might. So my question is, what could kill what you're doing? I mean, what keeps you up at night? Is it technology? Is it competitors? Is it, I don't know, what?
So today, we're expecting parity between electric vehicles and internal combustion engines by 2024. So my deadline for anything getting built and done is 2024, which is...
Why is that? Why is that a deadline?
So once they're in parity, there's no reason why people shouldn't choose electric fleets, right? They don't have to go into a long-term contract necessarily. On the infrastructure side, they may, but not necessarily on the vehicle side, right? The other piece is that it's an opportunity, but a lot of risk as well, right? I'm taking a lot of risk today, building something, getting things out with unproven technologies and unproven companies on the commercial vehicle side. So that's a big risk on our side. So what can kill it is bad technology, right? Bad vehicles, bad charging infrastructures, bad reputation. People say, we're not going to do this anymore because it's just not worth it. So that's a big thing. The other piece is that financing. I mean, this requires, the whole clean tech industry requires, I think it's somewhere like $2.3 trillion every year until 2040 if we want to keep, our goals, targets. So that's a lot of money, and we want a piece of that money. And, that's a lot of financing to find. There are lots of great companies who are willing to provide financing. We're talking to them. But potentially, if everyone wants financing, how do they sort of make that happen? So financing is a big deal.
And this 2024 window The point is that you have essentially 5 years before you're disintermediated, before the
Yes.
market doesn't need you anymore.
Not necessarily need me. I will always have my services in this market that will continue, but it may not need my business model as planned today.
I see.
Right? I think that's why the flexibility in between hardware and software, between the financing and the business model and the other options is important. Because it's extremely uncertain today where the industry is going to go in 4 or 5 years. And we're sort of optimizing to the unknown. And that's a very dangerous thing, potentially. Yes.
So you mentioned optimizing into the unknown.
Yeah.
Is the bulk of the problem to try to understand the risk, or are you also actively trying to manage the risk by, for example, is there a way to ensure that some other company that's not you is delivering a good charger, a good truck?
Yeah, so understanding the risk is a big portion of this. And we know that we're not going to understand 100%, but we want to make sure that we cross every T and dot every I when it comes to the things that we can think about, right? That is sort of developing the business model with different partner equipment, trying to figure out what the contract length, what the risk, what the discount rate has to be. And so doing all those financial modeling is a big thing. Now that we know that we're not going to understand the risk 100%, whatever we can't understand, our goal is to develop a set of tools to manage that as best as we can and minimize it for our company and for our customers.
If you don't mind, a follow-up question. What does that look like, that second part?
Oh, the second part is really around, so let's see, we are not going to be able to quantify the performance of the vehicles until we start running them. So at the beginning, we may not buy those vehicles, but we may lease them. And we may be very interested in monitoring each and every component that are high cost and trying to come up with things around, do we have the spare parts constantly to make sure that no one's stranded, so taking the risk, safety risk and things like that. But also being able to pay in bulk for those components so that it can cost less for us. And then, of course, being able to predict which components are going to fail, developing some software around predicting the component failure and managing that as well. And then providing feedback to those vehicle manufacturers saying, listen, this component of yours, we know it has failed all the time. You know, if you continue to buy it from this supplier, we're not going to start work with you. And then trying to be better at what we do, but also trying to get the industry to be better at their choices as well.
To the point of 2024 and sort of being disintermediated, is anyone in the traditional trucking space does anybody have the long-term service model already?
So let's see, there are companies, fleet management companies today that provide internal combustion engines, and they provide the leasing, they provide maintenance, insurance. What they don't do is electric vehicles because they don't know the infrastructure side and all that. And what they don't do also is this type of a business model, per mile cost, right? So we're sort of innovating on their business model. It's very difficult for big companies to change their entire systems to go from their existing leasing model to a per mile, engagement with their customers. So they're big ships, they can't move, so there's an advantage for us. But they also have a lot of data and they have a lot of needs. So we also work with them too, because they know that our tool can help the fleets that they're working with to electrify. They know that our infrastructure as a service could be very valuable for the customers that they're working with who are trying to electrify. So if we eat their food at the end, they're okay with it, but I think that they're going to buy us over time because why not, And that's sort of one of the, don't tell them.
So a lot of times when there's some documentary, Who Killed the Electric Car. And the big company that bought the battery company shut it down. So can you be sure they're not gonna shut you down and just keep going with what they're gonna do and just take that whole, whole model and just put it back into combustion engines?
Well, depends, right? I mean, it's our sort of, when we get there, we'll make sure to also do our due diligence on who's offering us what and at what cost. I can't tell you today, but I'm assuming that the reason they would buy us is because they see a future in it, they see a growth opportunity, not necessarily a killing opportunity. And so maybe I'm too, maybe I'm too positive and optimistic, but that's what I'm hoping.
All right, it's a little after 5:30, so thank you, Sila, for coming. One last round of applause.
And John and Brian, if people here are interested in Hard Earth next term, either taking your class or coming to the talks, what should they do? Look for emails or something, or?
Yeah, look for emails. If you want to be added to the listserv, you can also help us, and we'll get you down, get your information.
Sila, thanks so much.
Of course.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks everyone for coming.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
When I missed the energy sunlight.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm doing the annual.
Yes.
So I'm trying to.